But my first question for you is, in your bio, you say, I love science, I love research, I love medicine. Um, I will also continue to say this, but you are the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Kentucky with an MD and PhD. You are a neurologist, a neuroscientist,
Oh,
a researcher, a medical writer. Listen, if no one hypes you up, I'm gonna hype you up, okay?
thank you. I love
Um,
it. I love it.
so you are
Oh,
now a stroke fellow at Emory. So that's just like the context, the intro, okay? My question for you is, what do you love about the brain, and what keeps you fired up about the work that you do every day?
thank you. At a young age, I had teachers tell me that I was very inquisitive, and the brain is the like very uncharted territory. And I think for me, I was always really interested in like these big questions. What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? Why do we exist? And the brain, it gives us insight into who we are as human beings, how we navigate the world, how we perceive, and all these big philosophical questions are centered in the brain because our reality is how we perceive it, and our brain
Mhm,
is how we perceive people, things, interact in our reality. So that kind of drew me into the brain.
mhm,
And then when I got to medical school, we have all these like basic courses like anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. One of them was neuroanatomy, and it tends to be a very difficult course for a lot of medical students. And it was difficult for me, like it kicked my derriere. But like I had this notebook of questions I would just sit and write. Oh, well, if this is lesioned, what happens? Or if this person has this brain lesion in the speech, how do they manifest? Or what are some of the cures we can give for this patient? So I would just like daydream,
mm,
about just like different questions, different pathways, different pathologies. And so I would take my notebook during office hours. I would ask questions that weren't always necessarily on the exam because I was just like fascinated by this, 4 to 5 pound organ that is, defines who we are. And so that led me into when I got into graduate school, my research in graduate school focused on vascular dementia and how that manifests in individuals and what are some of the um, cognitive patterns for people that have vascular dementia. And I also focused on other types of dementia, such as Alzheimer's, Lewy body, frontal temporal lobar degeneration as well.
mhm.
And because of that interest, when I came back after I finished grad school, came back to medical school to finish the clinical years, and the question was, okay, so now what kind of doctor do you want to be? It just made sense. I love the
Mhm.
brain. I have a PhD in neuroscience. I'm gonna be a neurologist. There's also a lot of health disparities in stroke and vascular dementia, so I can
Mhm.
continue to do that work as well.
Wow. So basically, you're saying that you're really smart and you excelled in school and you had great interests and you're fueling that passion. Yes, that's what I heard you say. Yeah.
You're too kind. There's a lot of things I don't know. I've learned along the way medicine is very humbling. And there's a lot of things that I don't know, and there's things that I do know. And like you said earlier, this field, you're a lifelong student, and I just enjoy learning. I enjoy talking to people, helping individuals, and making medicine better for people that look like us and for the greater community.
Yeah, I love that. So, on that point, and you started to touch on this, how do you think about your role? And I mean, like both the burden and the privilege as
Mm.
like a Black like doctor and scientist in the spaces that you get to be in.
Yeah, it goes back to that question that my thesis mentor asked, and she is a black female, Dr. Anita Fernander, who's a health disparities researcher, and she asked that question, why did you decide to focus on black individuals? I think it's a privilege because I could come into these spaces that no one is thinking about these questions, and I come and say, okay, you're going to do this clinical trial. You're going to enroll X amount of people who are highly educated because the clinical trials, clinical data, clinical research tends to be highly educated white individuals who have access to academic centers.
Hmm.
If we continue to do research with that cohort, then the data is not going to be generalizable. So then,
Yeah.
okay, how do you recruit a more diverse cohort? Okay, so then we're like, well, we need to start recruiting people of color or black individuals, African American individuals. But the pitfall that tends to happen that I come to the table and I can bring is, okay, but then the studies will say, well, I tried to recruit these individuals, they just don't want to participate. And I
Ugh.
ask the question, well, why do you think that is? Let's break it down. Let's talk about Tuskegee. Let's talk about, the father of gynecology who practiced his tools on unnecessized slaves. Let's
Mhm,
talk about, polio. Let's talk about the historical mistreatment of Black individuals in medicine. And then once we understand the historical context, then we just got to be real with the patients and the researchers and say, hey, look, until you understand the history,
mhm,
individuals of color, there's going to be this hesitancy, which for just cause, to want to participate in anything that's
mhm,
research.
mhm,
So that's what
mhm,
I bring to the table. I bring a different lens because, of the skin color that I am and the gender that I am. And I can talk about these issues that I think are like obvious, but they're
mhm,
not obvious. So
mhm,
I see it as a privilege, but I also see it as it can take a toll because you come into work. I'm having to compete and do the work as a physician, as a scientist, and now I have to also take on this. It can be taxing,
mhm.
cultural taxation of, okay, now I got to be the Black female in the room talking about racism that some
Mhm.
people just don't want to hear.
Mhm.
I've made it my goal to be like, if you don't want to hear it, I'll go into a different room and talk about it. And then looking for opportunities and rooms where, oh, they want to hear, they're open, they're progressive, they want to, do the right thing.
We have to do a better job of
Yes.
removing the barriers and the things
Yes.
that keep people from, saying yes and moving forward. Otherwise, we're just
Mm,
perpetuating the cycle of people not wanting to be involved.
hmm I
Um,
completely agree because you take, for example, I've read different papers, clinical trials design. You take a clinical trial that requires the patient to come to the clinic once a month. And we know with caregiving, if you have a patient who's near the end stage of the Alzheimer's disease, having to take that patient once a month to a doctor's visit that is for research, that's a burden.
yeah.
Some people may not have the transportation, the access, the
Yep.
time to take off work to be able to take this patient. And I think
Yep.
those are things that is not taken into consideration. That is
Mhm.
another burden, another obstacle for individuals. I think if, like you said, if we make the clinical study more accessible and
Yeah.
we reduce the burden so that all people can join,
Mhm.
then that makes for better, more rigorous research. But then
Yeah.
having that, and having that insight, that's why it's so important, not just to include physicians and scientists in clinical trials. There's a push to include caregivers, community leaders, activists, in the beginnings when we're designing the study so that we can address some of the things that you brought up so that we make the clinical design inclusive and not exclusive.